coming out. This is the last panel of our spring conference on inequality. As I've said in advance of a couple of the other panels, the COMPAS program stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And each year we try to spotlight on one very important issue that we believe we need voices from many different disciplines and from different members of the public in order to address them adequately. And what we've taken on this year was talking about aspects of inequality or different kinds of inequalities and what we might do about them. And as with other years, there's only so much you can do, but we've tried to cover what we can. And we're really excited to have this panel as part of our spring conference because it's something we hadn't been addressing very well during the rest of the year, but I think it's an important discussion. So again, thank you very much for coming. What I'm going to do right now is hand things over to Mark Spindleman, who is a professor of law at the Moritz College of Law here at Ohio State, and then he'll be moderating the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and thanks to all of the people who organized the panel and the conference. My job is just to sort of do some quick introductions and then mostly get out of the way for a bit, and then I guess we'll have a little bit of conversation up here on the panel, and then invite you all to join in for those of you who are just joining for the first time. So I'll introduce the speakers in order of that will speak. First is Dr. Devanuj Dasgupta, who is an assistant professor of geography and women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Connecticut, proud graduate of the Ohio State University, where he was awarded his PhD. His research focuses on the global governance of migration, sexuality, and HIV. He's engaged in a community-based ethnographic project that documents the human rights abuses of transgender detainees in detention centers across the United States. His work has been published in a variety of journals, including Disability Studies Quarterly, Contemporary South Asia, Sexualities, and The Scholar and the First Amendment. I'm going to keep the introduction short. There's much more to say about both of the speakers than I'll have time to say. To my immediate left, the second speaker is Professor Jennifer Suchland. She's Associate Professor in Slavic and Eastern European Languages and Cultures and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Ohio State. She recently published a book, Economies of Violence, Transnational Feminism, Post-Socialism, and the Politics of Sex Trafficking from Duke University Press. She works on critical human rights with research on how violence is represented in culture and law, and how this shapes advocacy and discourses of violence and justice. Her recent work is on political homophobia in Russia and Eastern Europe, especially as connected to a global anti-gay and anti-gay agenda and racial national politics in Russia. So, without any further ado, Devanuj, take it away, please.
So, can you all hear me? I'll be very quick. All right. So I promise I won't bore you with details of my slides, but it's kind of there to help me speak through some of the things. So as Professor Spindleman enumerated my work, I'm calling it trans governance. What I'm interested in looking at is transgender as this emerging term of recognition across multiple scales and the kinds of recognition, with recognition, the kinds of new regulation and forms of governance that comes with transgender as a recognition from multiple agencies, either in the nation state or different UN agencies. And I'm doing cross-spatial work. I'm doing work in the US with transgender detainees, particularly in Santa Ana Detention Center in the city of Santa Ana. And I'm working with transgender Hijra activists in Calcutta who are working with the state government and the national government since transgender is a category of legalization. The Transgender Bill of Rights in the Indian Parliament that seeks to legalize transgender as a minority category and protects transgender people and gives them rights. But it comes with this double bind where the government has a definition for transgender that is around gender reassignment surgery, and so takes on this Western medical model of transgender and maps it onto bodies that have different sex gender variations and do not match this definition of gender reassignment. However, if they don't match the definition, they don't qualify for this minority-based protection. So there is this paradox with the Hindu right-wing government wanting to legalize transgenders and transgender activists actually opposing that bill. So I'm interested in how this term transgender is created in different global forums, transnational philanthropic circles and activist circles in the UN, and then it circulates and gets sedimented through different modalities of governmentality. So violent national security governmentality in the case of detention, apparently benign state recognition in the case of India, however still creating a form of violence through which certain kinds of indigenous sex gender variations are erased and forced into a trans identity. But the crux of my argument, and this slide really comes out of having to tell geographers why I'm doing geography and women's gender studies, but also to kind of to bring back the question of scales. As a political geographer, I take scales very seriously, and then why does geography and this human rights language and the operationalization of human rights at multiple scales is important for me, because the question of scale, I'm interested in geopolitics of the scale of the body, so the geopolitics of, different kinds of governmentality that deals with the question of trans inequality at the scale of the body. What is this doing, this emerging governance doing to the body or through the body? And number two is, I think it's important to think of human rights as a global aspiration, but through local maneuvers. Like, what are LGBT activists, in my case LGBT activists, how are they maneuvering or using human rights discourse, Yogyakarta principles, specifically in the case of LGBT work, at multiple scales and local levels. And I really want to even question what gets termed as the local scale and the global scale, and how actually what we think of as the local in terms of human rights work is actually creating emerging languages that then forms what we now come to think of global human rights language, such as the Yogyakarta principle. And I won't go into the story of Santa Ana because I don't have time for that. So broadly, I want to just kind of speak about how this emerging regime of trans recognition is a new form of regulation that is attempting to deal with inequality. In the case of India, what it is doing is the Transgender Bill of Rights. The first section of it is actually a huge section of definition of who is transgender. Right, so here is a picture of me working with two trans activists at a time in Kolkata where there was a huge division, conflict between local Koti trans group. Koti is a term for, very quickly, men having sex with men with, potentially genderqueer feminine presentations who do not necessarily fall under the gender reassignment-based transgender rubrics, right? So December 2013 is when we have in India the anti-sodomy related Supreme Court decision passed, which actually what it ruled for was a ruling down of the rereading of the anti-sodomy provision in the Indian Penal Code. The New Delhi High Court in 2009 had actually removed sodomy, essentially decriminalized sodomy, and the Supreme Court appeal case recriminalized sodomy on the basis of sodomy being Western. It doesn't fit Indian culture, right? And the public health argument was that, okay, if you are arguing that this is a criminal behavior, that this is a high-risk behavior, therefore there should be legal limits to this high-risk behavior, so we should keep the anti-sodomy provisions. So that was December 2013. What we are also getting in April 2014 is the Supreme Court of India passing a decision, a landmark decision, that said that Indian citizens have the right to choose their own gender identity between male, female, and other. So all of our documents documents, passports, national IDs, different forms of IDs, have male, female, and other. And so the question became is what is the use for this, for the document? What is the use for the right to choose your own gender identity? And then the newly elected BJP government took upon itself to present a series of bills. First one was criminalization of violence against trans bodies. And there was a standalone bill, and when that was about to get passed, they removed that bill and decided to actually introduce the Transgender Bill of Rights, which would give transgender people, based on the definition, a minoritarian status, like scheduled caste, scheduled tribe people, which are people who are outside the caste system who are protected by the Indian Constitution. But what it did was it created the gender reassignment-based, surgery-based definition, medical definition of transgender as the standard for receiving your transgender-related certificate, right? So in India, we have at every state level a state transgender welfare board now, and that is working on different schemes to address issues of trans inequality, right? So, given the sort of, leftover of the Nehruvian state, which was interested in some form of redistribution, and 1980s onwards, a movement towards neoliberalism in India. However, the welfare state cannot, the semblance of the Nehruvian welfare state cannot completely retrench itself in India, because then there wouldn't be a national identity. But precisely at the moment which you feel you're part of the Indian nation state is when you have access to some of these state-based resources, like ration stores, like access to small business loans through the government. And so for trans folks, then not matching the decision, not matching the gender identity definition risks them not having access to these resources. So what I'm arguing then is what this sort of global definition of transgender, which emerges from the Kristen Jorgensen's experience of traveling to Denmark, getting her sex changed, and so from the get-go, the term transgender gets connected with gender reassignment surgery or a change narrative, is when people who are not invested in a change of their body and their multiple sex gender presentations, these kinds of global definitions of transgender and global ideas about transgender human rights are taken up by interlocutors such as middle-class NGOs in India. And what my fieldwork reveals is these conflicts between poor, precarious, quoting trans workers who do not necessarily want to take up this trans label through the reassignment surgery with NGO heads, right? So the interlocutor for this legal recognition-based trans rights is more often than not middle-class NGO heads who are English educated and are amenable or understanding the trans reassignment-based definition. And so what I'm arguing then is, what it is doing is it's creating its own set of inequality. It's creating its own set of inequality because what it is doing is it's the idea of transgender rights and recognition through the state is actually covering over forms of inequality such as caste, class, region, and ethnicity, which is central to understanding social stratification in India, through which actually the sex-gender-based differences are expressed and framed. So it's covering over. So often these kind of global governance-based idea that is traveling, hooking itself at the state level, nation-state level, is actually covering over forms of inequality through which we have to understand sexual difference, right? Sexual differences, there isn't kind of this universal sexual difference, such as transgender, but sexual difference is framed through, in the case of India, other social stratification markers, such as your race, such as your religion, your caste, your regional location, and this frames the inequality, and that inequality remains untouched through the state-based recognition of transgender. So I'll stop there, and I'll be open to questions.
Thank you, Devonish, for getting us warmed up, and Mark for starting this off, and for the invitation to be here with you today. I look forward to our conversation. What I'd like to do is really make a couple of arguments. So as many of you know, Russia has been in the news of late because of its so-called gay propaganda laws. And so it doesn't seem to be at the forefront of gay rights in the world, right? So what I'd like to suggest to you today is that rather than think about Russia as an outlier, as a country that is opposed to the West, that seems to be for gay rights, particularly in terms of the expansion of marriage rights and anti-discrimination law, that in fact, political homophobia in Russia is very much part of the transnational project that is intimately tied to the right in the United States and Europe. The second piece that I want to put forward is, in terms of understanding Russian political homophobia, I also think there's a misconception here that, particularly in Western media and understandings of what's happening, there is a sense that political homophobia in Russia or anti-gay laws are primarily about a political agenda that's about gender and sexuality. And while this is certainly the case, I make a strong argument that this is actually a racialized discourse and very much a part of how Russia wants to envision itself as a population. And so we must think about political homophobia in Russia as part of a wider project of anti-migration and colonialism. So let me just throw out a couple things. Happy to talk about things during the Q&A as well. So what I have here is what is supposedly this Cold War, or the sexual Cold War divide. On the left hand, you have Nastoyashaya Semya, which is a normal family, Nastoyashaya. It's a Russian word that just is like, a real thing. This is the real kind of family. And you see the heteronormative structure of the family. And on the right is what people who are very critical of gay rights call the gay ropa flag. And so the juxtaposition of these two flags suggests that there is this sexual Cold War. And what I'd like to say is that, in fact, there isn't. There's a transnational political homophobia. And what you have on the left is actually a very similar image. The image was actually taken from the French anti-gay marriage L'Homme Portu, and Russia basically took the image and made it its own in its own straight pride flag. And there was actually potential litigation that the French organization was really ticked off that their image had been taken, and Russia, etc. So there's some squabbling there. But then these are some other, maybe you've seen these. These are sort of versions of straight pride flags in the United States. So the idea of straight pride, quote unquote, isn't unique to Russia, and this goes beyond the symbolic level. So there are these gay propaganda laws that were passed in 2013, and really what they do is regulate free speech. And this woman here on the left, Elena Mizulina, she was sort of the main author of these laws, and she's also a deputy prime minister in the Russian Duma, and is part of a committee that deals with the family, women, family, and children. And what I have here on the right is, in 2014, the World Congress of Families, maybe you've heard of this organization, had set to have their meeting in Russia. And so this image was really just illustrates that the sort of political homophobia goes beyond the symbolic, but in fact that there are institutional or sort of resources, shared bureaucracy, shared conversations between this organization, the World Congress of Families, which actually I can give you more details if you wish, but was inspired by two Russian academics, an American visiting, reading the works of these Russian academics, decided to create this World Congress of Families. So there's a east-west, back and forth ping-ponging over the history of this organization. And so the 2014 meeting actually technically didn't happen because the visas were revoked because this is right after the taking of Crimea And so there was some, obviously, brouhaha around whether or not people could travel to this, but it did clandestinely actually happen, but under the name, a different name. So I just want to suggest that there are these ties, and I just want to show you, you obviously can't see this at all, but this is actually a flowchart of, on the right-hand side, different Russian political figures, including Yakunin, who is a Russian oligarch around transportation and his funding of the World Congress of Viennese meetings, the most recent of which is going to be in Tbilisi, Georgia. And on the left-hand side, you have sort of key figures in the American World Congress of Viennese organization. And so this reaches from the very bottom here on the left to the originator of the organization to the very top, which are the people who are sort of more contemporary political figures in this organization. So there are other connections, but this is something that I did not draw up. I don't think I have those graph skills, but I believe it was in the Atlantic a few years ago. Okay, so one last example is, maybe you've heard of Scott Lively. He's been in the news quite a bit because of his role, and he's actually, the Center for Constitutional Rights is spearheading a litigation against him because of his role in the anti-gay laws in Uganda. And he has also been very active in, and has a relationship with Russian anti-gay groups. And so one is actually related to this film called Sodom that was made by this, very mainstream, but also incredibly conservative Russian political figure, or popular political figure, and they created this documentary called Sodom. And so they use Scott Lively in there quite a bit to talk about just sort of how homosexuality is the bane of Western civilization. And at the time when it was created, I believe it was in maybe 2014, it didn't have a lot of traction here, but actually recently it's been translated into English, and so you can actually watch the film with English subtitles. Which again suggests this flow between the East and the West, rather than a Cold War system. Okay, the last thing I want to just mention is, in addition to throwing out the idea that political homophobia in Russia is less about anti-liberalism, but part of actually a global, transnational connection, I think we should also rethink how political homophobia is read in Russia as primarily an issue of gender politics. In this regard, I want to emphasize the way in which Russian political homophobia, and what do I mean by, I'm assuming political scientists know this term. So political homophobia is, you can have a country that doesn't uphold gay rights or doesn't actively move towards advancing gay rights or equality, anti-discrimination, etc. And that's different from political homophobia, which is about enacting active laws to regulate, to punish, to make gay and lesbians, gay LGBTQ people second-class citizens. And so, in this regard, this gentleman here, Nikolai Zhakhov, or actually, this is quoted from his book, but this is the Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin, who's often in the news. I just want to pinpoint one thing here. You maybe see this quote, I'll read it out loud. It really crystallizes sort of the discourse of political homophobia in Russia. So Russia, this is him, Rogozin speaking, Russia is the authentic Europe. Without the domination of gays, without pederast marriages, without false punk culture, without flunkyism towards America, we are true Europeans. We have always survived. We have proven our Europeanness in ways against both the Crusaders and the Mongols, each and every time. So this is not just a rote quote. This is actually very much the context in which much of the so-called gay propaganda laws are understood. And this is that Russia, increasingly at the level of meta-discourse, understands itself as an Orthodox Christian nation, and as such, in many regards, as the last bastion of European civilization, right? That so-called Western Europe has really muddled it all, and Russian Orthodoxy is actually going to save the world. Some of this is quite messianic. There are sort of Eurasianists, so-called Eurasianists, like Dugin, who propose that Eurasia is sort of the savior of the world. But this is a racialized understanding of Europe. When one invokes Europe, one at the same time invokes the racialized imperial histories of Europe. So Europe codes as a racial category, as about whiteness. And I just sort of think about the east-west of this, maybe some of you know about Richard Spencer, who's the author of the notion of alt-right. Well, he's a huge fan of Russia, actually, and he in fact has called Russia the greatest white nation in the world. So the idea that a sort of the sexual understanding of the nation being intertwined to a racialized understanding of the nation is very much present in Russia, although this sort of whiteness doesn't get read much in the Western press, I would say. Okay, so let me just end by showing you this image, two last images. One is, ironically, this image here, which is about the population, making, what Russia is in the situation now of depopulation. And so, some of the work that I'm doing is really analyzing policy as well as political discourse around population. But this image actually is not coming from Russia. This image, randomly, I was researching some other sort of right Christian organizations in the United States. So the World Congress of Families isn't it. There's a whole mess of them. And there's another one that was just recently, in the last few years, developed by, Brian, the last name is Brian, I believe. And in any case, this shows up on their website. And so I haven't yet deciphered who's the author or who's the artist of this, but just the ways in which the imagery around sort of white nationalist / Christian conservative groups in the U.S. are drawing on the iconography of a Russian population to advance their conservative views. And I just want to end with this, these two images here. On the right, we had a banner that's basically saying, "Return Russia to Russians." And on the left is a certificate that Russian women can now receive if they have more than 2 children. So maternal capital is called. And so what I'm suggesting is that we can't see political homophobia outside of this context of wanting to create a certain ethnic idea of a Russian population that's very much anti-migrant, as well as sort of these pro-natalist policies, such as the Have Sex and Have Babies National Day, which is, it's not called that, but it's basically called that. National Procreation Day, I guess is the easiest way to say that. So I'll end there, but we can chat more if you wish.
So I guess I want to just try to put a couple of initial conversational balls in the air, if I could do that. So I guess part of what is so fascinating to me about hearing these two talks both individually and together is that they both operate, as I'm sort of registering them, as different modes of critique of international human rights as a project that we all ought to be invariably for. Sort of on the one hand, it's possible maybe to see Jenny's project and work as a kind of recognition of maybe a shadow, sort of contra international human rights law in relation to lesbian and gay and trans identities, where these are sort of the press backs against it with both sort of global universalist aspirations and simultaneously all of the ways in which the international project can sort of inspire multinational or transnational collaboration with nationalist projects in mind. But sort of shared enmity in relation to some of the things that are weakening the nationalist projects in various sorts of ways. And Dr. Dasgupta's account really, I think, powerfully sort of illustrates some of the ways in which the pro-LGBT projects can operate not as people domestically in law or internationally in relation to human rights. Imagine that these human rights projects on behalf of these identity-based constituencies are lovely, happy, smiling projects of liberation only, with no effective costs except to the costs of sort of the old ways of living, which are homophobic, transphobic, and ought to be discarded anyway, but that actually these liberatory projects have a kind of sharp-toothed edge to them on the ground, not only in terms of disrupting local cultures or whatnot, but also effectively in many respects regulating and dominating the very populations in whose name ostensibly they're articulated. And so I just wonder if, as some initial matter, you might sort of talk a little bit about how you understand the work you're doing sort of in relation to the International Human Rights Project and all of its happy liberationist impulses. And in the course of it, I just want to ask if you could just talk a little bit more in the course of that about this idea of covering over. I think it's a really important point, and I want to make sure everybody sees the regulatory effects of this quote-unquote liberationist, or what might be quoted sort of by this audience as a kind of liberationist pro-trans project. So whoever wants to go first.
And actually there's some interesting similarities that we could tease out, I think, between the India and Russia case. So maybe I can maybe ask you a question in a bit about that. But related to what I would say is sort of the implications. So this is just a new early project that I've been working on, and one of the main implications that I'm really teasing out is sort of the insufficiency of liberal gay rights as a response to both the transnational aspect of this, as well as the multiply imbricated aspects of sort of gay propaganda laws, right? So what I would say there is this is a challenge both sort of for people outside of Russia who want to think about being in solidarity with LGBTQ people in Russia, as well as a challenge for organizers within Russia. Because what I would say is a couple things there. One is that, let's see, sort of externally, I think there's been a, fueled in part by some of the diaspora like Masha Gessen and others who are, that there's a rise of asylum cases to the United States from Eastern Europe. I'm getting emails all the time, can you help with this case? So that kind of thing fuels a liberal response, right? A liberal response meaning of recognition of sort of the face value of LGBTQ rights. But in doing that, it's actually fueling the very controversy, or the very sort of Achilles heel of LGBTQ rights in Russia. And that, it's hard to put a sort of fine point on it here in such a short amount of time, but LGBTQ rights are seen as PC, right? And in this regard, against free speech. So believe it or not, in the European Court of Human Rights, Alexei Alexeyevich, who went to court, maybe some of you know, because the Moscow refused to allow there to be a gay pride parade. Well, the European Court of Human Rights found him, charged Russia for not allowing him to have his free speech. But if you look at the court case, Russia argues that its freedom of speech, right, it protects its own freedom of speech, and its exception within the European Council, because the population of Russia is overwhelmingly heterosexual. This is their argument of the state. So they find it offensive to have openly gay, pride parade, what have you, right? So the gay rights aren't going to solve that problem, right? The liberal gay rights are not going to address within Russia the ways in which this language, the very language of LGBTQ, isn't going to resolve the issue of illiberalism in Russia, right? So that's one piece of it. Within the context, what I would say is that and just very briefly, but basically since the 90s, and then with the sort of first flood of funding into the democratization project of Russia, there's been a decline in external funds as so-called consolidation happened, as well as a confining from vis-a-vis the Russian state of foreign funding to help run NGOs in the Russian Federation. And that actually really led to a splintering of groups and a competition amongst groups rather than a coalition building. And that has been to the detriment of an intersectional understanding of any politics in Russia, whether or not it's the environment or women's rights or gay rights. And so rather than being coalitional partners, they've actually become competitors for scarce resources. And this, I think, is a huge problem, in particular as I'm arguing that the larger issue of the people and regulating the population is what's at stake with these gay propaganda laws, and not just sort of discrete so-called gay rights. So I would say that's one brief take on the question.
Okay, so before I answer my question, my honest confession is Jenny was on my dissertation defense committee, so it's great to sit on the same table with someone who defended it. And a long time ago, I wrote an email to Mark, and no heard back from him. I wanted to take his classes, so it's really great to be. No, it's really okay, because as I told you, now that I'm on the other side, so many students write to me, and I have to prioritize who I get back to. So I get it, I'm not hurt.
In my own defense, I just found this email the other day and I brought it up. So, I mean, I've been feeling very guilty about it, so I appreciate the chance to have a public purging of the guilt.
But all this to say is, I'm so grateful to be back on the campus that kind of produced me as an academic subject, and be nostalgic also. And then I'll return to, and also Professor Hubin had reached out to me when I was a graduate student, when CHEV and Compass was being formed, and actually showcase some of my work as one of the grad students doing work in remote areas. So it's really great to be coming back and giving back to the institution. On that note, to go back to the case of covering over, so of course I'm drawing from political philosopher Falguni Patrick-Shade's work towards a political philosophy of race, where she uses Heidegger's idea of covering over to talk about race, right? So in her work, she talks about any form of badness or unruliness is kind of created, and race is basically related. Race is a category that categorizes any form of unruliness and then actually covers over the fundamental violence that state produces in certain bodies in order for it to exist, right? And so I've been thinking over, and then also Rafael de la Dehesa's work in the context of Brazil, where he traces the colonization of Brazil and Latin America and the experience of the formation of colonial sexual categories. It's very different from, let's say, the civilizing move, where in Brazil the covering over was we want to make you like us. It wasn't that we want to tame you. It was a different sort of take on it. So the covering over in the context of India, let me just give you two examples, because I like to think as an ethnographer. Number one was when I was in Kolkata, there was this fight between the lesbian feminist organization, which is primarily middle-class, English-educated, and a local Koti trans group, because one of their members was actually a client of the lesbian feminist organization, psychiatrist, who was going to write her or him, he goes by she, he, both, the diagnosis for gender dysphoria that would allow him to get hormones on the market in India. Now, the psychiatrist denied the gender dysphoria diagnosis because the client said, I don't want to have a sex change surgery. I am a sex worker and I would like to keep my penis, but I would like a feminine body, hence I want access to hormones. And she read this as potentially a decorative move and not a gender dysphoria, right? And so these two apparently LGBT bodies who kind of share similar goals came into terrible conflict with each other. And what was happening then for me is, as I was hanging out with both these organizations, that I was watching essentially the power of the psychiatric institution, housed in this lesbian feminist organization, to deny access to hormones, because of the interpretation of APA's new to DSM-5 and WPATH. And so this whole debate then went public, and we ended up having to organize a public staging of this fight between the lesbian feminist organization and the local open organization on this issue, right? And the person concerned had to be outed because she wanted to have a dialogue in public with her counselor. So watching this dialogue, what became apparent to me is how WPATH, which is which is another variation of the American Psychiatric Association's global standard of DSM-5 decision around gender dysphoria, was being interpreted in the context of Kolkata by a psychiatrist, right? And then she said, look, the entire psychiatric establishment here looks at me, they know I'm a lesbian psychiatrist, with the responsibility of giving you this dysphoria. And then if anything goes wrong, the entire psychiatric institution will look at me for having something done wrong, right? So this is very much attends to what gestures to what I'm calling is covering over the actual inequality in the case of my friend who is looking for, she's a sex worker who's actually looking to modify her body to attend to clients to increase her income. So the conversation was really around her ability to do her work in order to earn, that was being interpreted through the lens of whether you're not trans enough, right? And so then that really connects to what is happening in India through the Transgender Bill of Rights, is the bill gives a definition of who is a transgender person. And then ones who do not want to have surgery, ones who do not, sort of get reread as non-authentic trans, and then don't have access to protections that the bill promises. And number two, what I wanted to point out was it's very tied to Indian nationalism. It's because the lead interlocutor for the Transgender Bill of Rights is a transgender upper class, upper caste, English educated hijra, Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, who has come out and formed her own first hijra Hindu Akhara, which is at Kumbh Mela, which is this very specific, very well-known religious mela. She's formed her own Akhara, and she's giving interviews in public saying, if the government of India gives us a chance, legally, gives us legal standing, we are going to help the government to remove Pakistan from the map of the world, right? So she's given this public interview. So this sort of, conundrum of, sexual and gender-based Hindu nationalism with the Hindu nationalist government, and the convergence of this government and these kinds of Hindu right-wing transgender and LGBT formations taking up this sort of Western universal definitions of human rights. I'm trying to still wrap my head around it, but this conundrum kind of shows that if we take human rights as this kind of universal marker, the way they are getting maneuvered at multiple scales is of importance to see what kinds of new inequalities they're creating.
So I just want to make sure everybody catches the sort of the implication of what I understood you to be saying. So correct me if I'm mistaken. So the idea here is that it is the trans rights are being advanced in the name of a nationalist project driven by a certain set of religious motivations, at least in part.
Yes, when I interviewed the Indian minister, the federal minister, the national minister for social justice and empowerment, and we do have ministries, national ministries like that in India. Sad that the US will never see something like that. That the minister said, oh, you know what? I asked him why now? Why Trans Bill of Rights now? And his answer was, after a long 10-15 minutes diatribe, what he shared for me is without the Hijras, we cannot have Kurukshetra. So this is reference to Mahabharata, reference to the Holy War, reference to the figure of a Hijra who was used by the warrior to win the war. So he's saying without bringing Hijras and Kutis into the nation state, we can't win over Pakistan. Because the real enemy is the Islamic nations, right? So it's this strange conundrum.
Yeah, part about, or, I mean, when I first heard about this, just sort of the idea of wrapping your head around a religious project driving in favor of trans rights just seems, it's wonderfully different from what we have here, impossible to think about sort of in the domestic context. I think maybe there's lots more to ask and say, but let's see sort of where people are.
I was just going to say one thing that's interesting about sort of a similarity here too is that so at the moment when you have this intense regulation of so-called gay propaganda in Russia, you have the release of increased representation of trans people. So there's a multi-series film following the life of different trans people in Russia. And so there's an interesting way in which, that as you were articulating, the kinds of ways that, that the story of transition, which is actually can be quite conservative in the sense that it maintains an idea of gender binarism, which again doesn't disrupt heteronormativity or patriarchy or what have you, that are still dangling when you talk about, gay and lesbian rights, queer rights, right? So you have this strange thing happening where you can't get any traction on, LGBTQ, but then T is getting all this attention precisely because it sort of reifies the gender normativity, sexual normativity as part of this national project, which is a very different genealogy than the US, which T was always a part of the very beginning of gay rights that was ignored, that was itself covered, and now is seen as like, the last, it's the last letter, right, in the acronym. Unless you go I and A.
As we turn to the audience, I'll just say, one of the things that was, there were lots of really interesting things to react to. I guess for me, as you were talking about this idea of covering up and the genealogy of the concept, I was thinking just we talk about that in critical legal theory as a form of legitimation instead of a form of covering up. I don't think that it traces back to Heidegger, sort of in the legal critical theory tradition, but it's sort of fun to hear about some of the different ways that these ideas are coming up.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Professor Justin. Evaluation, both of you say. So I totally on board with your concerns about kind of medicalized definitions of what is transgender. But I was wondering what you thought the takeaway from this should be. So if there's going to be, what you thought, yes, there should be a transgender bill of rights, but the definition, the legal codification of who counts as transgender needs to be broadened in some way, and I was wondering how you do it. Or if you thought, no, actually, the whole project of having a transgender bill of rights is bad because it's inevitably going to involve, it's going to require some kind of legal codification. Who counts and who doesn't, and that's just inevitably going to exclude some people that they don't exclude, and so I was just wondering which way you go on that.
Thank you for the question, so I first have to situate the specific case in the context of India, right? Because the state has different semblance of welfare mechanisms, not like the Scandinavian model of welfare state, but has a semblance of welfare mechanisms that also operates through weird conundrums, right? Protection for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe folks in jobs, in public sector jobs, in political parties, in representation. 33% of political representation is protected for women, 33% of jobs in federal and state. So there's this that, and this is trying to mimic that format. And so it would just mimic similar debates around that, There are several scholars who are written about Adivasis having to give like a certain number of chickens to the tribal head to get the tribal certificate, right? So there is this, it's going to mimic that. I wish I had an answer in terms of the strategy. The feel with the organizations that I'm working with is that, no, we should not get rid of the transgender Bill of Rights completely, but it is about who gets to negotiate and with whom. And so interestingly, they're forging some of these transnational sort of connections. They are coming there now at the UN level, since we have a SOGI, which is the sexual orientation and gender identity expert. They're wanting to build some relationship there. The bill is kind of, as of now, stale and sitting. It's not, the Prime Minister has lots of big fishes to fry at this point. But it'll come back again. And I think I go back as a geographer to the question of scale, is that we have, what will happen in this case is how will human rights, this kind of universal declaration, refugee conventions, Yogyakarta conventions, will get reinterpreted in these precise conflicts. And I wish I had one narrative, but it's conflicting, multiple. But for me as a geographer, what it primarily shows is two things. It shows the paradox of scale between the global, the national, and the local, and I think the nation emerges the last between these two. And it also shows a paradox between internationally accepted standards and definitions for human rights, for adjudicating LGBT rights, and the sovereign, the role of the sovereign nation state in just not its physical boundaries, but its moral boundaries, as Jen is pointing out. But I think the struggle, it'll generate its own answer through kind of these local struggles. Because civil society, and especially feminist and queer civil society, in its multiple form in India is very, very thriving, right? And there is huge coalition between Adivasi, scheduled caste organizations, precarious worker organizations, and trans worker organizations. They're more interested in larger, movement building and challenging equality and neoliberalism and gentrification and questions of sustainability because they're living on the edge of the city than sort of angle of LGBT rights.
Can I just ask a follow-up, just out of curiosity? In geography, is there a field sort of dominant norm in relation to prescriptiveness? I mean, in other words, do you feel some kind of obligation, sort of in the context of doing your work as a geographer, to take a turn to the prescriptive, or
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so I mean, in law, it's typically the case that the idea is the law professor is supposed to, in general, this is sort of just the dominant norm, it's not the only possibility. You look at a problem in the world, you take what you've studied, what you've whether it's about cases, whether it's about policy, and you're supposed to it's good legal scholarship or standard legal scholarship these days, and it has been for some time to get prescriptive. Say, here's how I think the problem should be solved, here's the problem, here's how people are engaging with the problem, and here's how I think people ought to be engaging with the problem. Usually how we ought to boss people around by grabbing a hold of some lever of the state. That's sort of classic law professor, law reform move. Real turn to the prescriptive, telling people how they ought to be living their lives, how they ought to be managing the problem that is being identified. And so I just wonder if sort of outside of that's not the only approach in law, but I would say...
Well, I mean, developing geography has done that historically, kind of had an analysis and a solution to two different kinds of geopolitical issues. But I think for feminist geographers, queer geographers, folks who are doing political geography, I'm thinking of Matt Coleman, who's here. I don't think that's the kind of work we need to do. I'm even pretending to be a geographer. I have a PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies, so it's because geography comes from the salary pretending to be a geographer. We don't do that. We're not trained to kind of be prescriptive. Prescriptions emerge from praxis, and I document that.
And it does depend on the methodologies that you're using in your research, I would say. So in interdisciplinary scholarship that I think we both engaged in, there's a tendency, as in the social sciences, to think of your work as not prescriptive, in part because you're trying to be objective, right? But I think that if your method is one that you see yourself as a subject within the research that you're doing, and you're doing, for example, participatory action research or something like that, then you do in the end aid the people that you're studying in some way, and that might be about lobbying or being prescriptive about certain laws, and that's certainly the case in the area of trafficking, for example. Something else that
I mean, the Ministry for Social Justice invited me to keep coming back into workshops with government and transgender stuff. He was like, oh, you're an expert in gender and sexuality, you should come to workshops for us. So it was like, he doesn't know I have data.
Oh, you're getting data.
So, so I have a question about Russia. I mean, I've known in the past about the transnational homophobia, the World Congress of Family. I've heard about that. Although some of the ways in which the Russian state has this, views itself as an ethno-state and uses homophobia that way, so that was news to me. As was the quote of that prime minister. And that makes me want to ask you the following question. I knew that American homophobia went to Russia. Is Russian homophobia actually leading Russia? Is it merely the case that Russia presents itself as the defender of Christianity? Or, I mean, in the French election right now, Putin's favorite, of course, is Marine Le Pen. His second favorite is François Fillon, who is quite closely associated with the anti-gay marriage thing. I mean, even more so than Le Pen. Is that something that Putin's Russia actually supports? Is Putin's Russia interested in exporting homophobia as well, or does it merely present itself as the last defender as opposed to the crusader against as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question could be interpreted as one about resources as well as leadership, right? So in terms of resources, I would say that Russia, different figures in Russia, whether or not they're oligarchs or political elite, have helped fund allies or similarly thinking people in other parts of the world. And so with Le Pen's party, for example, or funding, for example, the World Congress of Families meeting in Tbilisi. So I think that there is a resource relationship. So in that regard, if you could interpret or think about that as exporting, right? Because it's about facilitating, a global movement, or I wouldn't call it a movement, but maybe it is a movement. There's this. Did you hear about there's a new sort of world, what's it called, the Durban Declaration, and it's a sort of a global declaration of like the family, of heteronormativity, and the meeting was, I think, a year ago, and you could sign this world, and Russia was facilitating, financially this, whether or not it's a leader, that requires some more sussing out, I think. And there's a journalist that I can recommend if you want to draw on some of his work, or just to think about this. So Casey Michael is his name, and he's a journalist for the Right Wing Watch. And he just published about 2 weeks ago, a piece on that site looking at the connections between the leadership and the resources of the religious and racist right in the United States and Russia. And what I would say is that I don't think that it's just Russia sort of beating its chest saying we're like, the last, bastion of Rome or the third Rome, but that it's actually a project, right? That it's something they're financially invested in, financially and ideologically invested in. So in that regard, seeing it as sort of messianic, right? That this is, in fact, its mission to be involved in, or some people feeling that way, that they should be involved in the politics of other countries. But let me just say this, and wherever I go, I'm saying this, and this is something that Casey Michael and others have been unearthing, is that it's not just a connection on the right, but there's a connection on the left. So Russia Today is a state-owned news source, and somehow it's getting on lists of being like a lefty type of news source, and it is absolutely not. Okay, it is a state-owned, and it is part of this kind of fake news apparatus. And guess who shows up at the 20th anniversary of Russia Today? It's unclear about to what extent this person was paid, but it was clearly in connection with Russia Today. It was there, was a representative, was being showcased at the anniversary. Jill Stein. You know about this. Okay, you have to tell people, right? So I think that it's really, it makes a lot of sense, these sort of connections on the right. We think, yeah, that makes sense. But I do think that as a project, in terms of the Russian political agenda, I mean, I don't know, I'm still sort of doing this research and thinking through it, but I'm increasingly seeing evidence of just a desire to create fissures, right? To create discord. And that means supporting what you would think would be antithetical to a Russian official government position, right? And so anyway, just want to add that extra. I see it as my mission to tell people about the Russia Today Jill Stein connection.
So just in a similar vein, talking about the exporting of the political transphobia,
Yeah.
how does that cooperate or mesh with the public opinion in areas where Russia is trying to expand or annex, such as annexing Crimea or some of the northeastern Slavic or northeastern European countries? Does that public opinion also translate well to those populations?
Yeah, this has been a real sort of divide, you know, within the post-Soviet. So many countries, including Hungary and other countries also called part of the European Union, have adopted actually legislation, so-called kind of gay propaganda laws. Many of the Central Asian countries have done this as well. Belarus, and in fact in Ukraine, what I would say is that this has actually been, again, this is not about just gender, it's about nationalism and the nation. That is your case with India, Devanush, is so actually Ukraine has increasingly been trying to use gay rights as this sort of flag of being anti-Russian. So, so if this is if I'm addressing your question, that in fact I think it is. And in fact, this is again the limitations of gay liberal rights, that to be part of the European Union, there's a set of compliances, right? And so part of the accession process, and this is an issue with Serbia, for example. And so this very issue that is so-called the litmus test to become European is one that's actually fueling racist nationalist backlash against gay rights and women's rights within Serbia. So the very thing that you think is actually about progressive politics is actually really being used against so-called liberal advances within. So this is happening in Serbia, it's been an issue in Ukraine. So I think those are a couple of examples.
What are the stakes of Europeanness, the true Europeanness as opposed to the true Russianness in that quote?
Right.
I mean, it was sort of an interesting bid. I mean, so especially against the backdrop of the nationalist project, like the bid is the true Europeanness. What do you make of that so far?
Right. Well, I think it's, at least in the Rogozin quote, I would say that Russia is very similar to the United States in many regards. So I would say that it thinks of itself as exceptional in so many ways, right? So this the Russian exceptionalism. So what I would say in this regard is that the ways in which the U.S. talks about itself as a proponent of democracy around the world. Or it may not use European because obviously we can't make the same kind of claims on that. But we make statements that suggest a kind of global positionality, like the power of our ethics, the power of the importance of our morality is a global positionality, right? And so I would say here, this is similar, that talking about Eurasia, which is not some kind of multinational alternative to the European Union. Eurasianism is a kind of ethnogenesis, a sort of resurgence of discourses of ethnogenesis in Russia, right? So Europeans is about making an argument about Russia and its global positionality, right? So in that regard, it's the Russian nation, but the Russian nation, its value vis-a-vis the globe. Yeah. Which I would hardly argue too. I enjoy this scholar Medina Tlastanova, who argues that Russia is a subaltern empire. So what this quote really illustrates is both this desire to be seen within Europe as European, right? But yet it always remains sort of secondary to that, right? It wasn't an equal to European imperial projects. You know, it was secondary. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union or the dismantling of the Soviet Union, right? A failed, alternative project to capitalism. It's sort of positioned as both imperial and secondary. So I think you see that on that quote as well.
I couldn't help but think while both of you were presenting about the literature on womanhood in nation building and the policing of women's identities as a part of the project of nation building and national identity building. We still see that obviously with the wars over the Muslim headscarf and niqab and so on, that women become a sort of flashpoint in the national identity building exercises or projects. But so in this comparative regimes of normalization, with the sort of paradoxical flip, the sort of seemingly progressive, but it's still a regime of normalization that's, I guess I'm wondering, has the project then shifted away from policing women's identities and what true womanhood is supposed to look like as part of the nation? Has that now completely shifted to these normalizing projects that focus on gender identity, sexuality, or are they coexisting? Are they alongside each other?
Sure. I mean, in the case of India, in this specific case, so the other side of all of this sort of political conjuncture in India, the other side is the reports of all the violent rape incidents in India, right? In 2013, we're also seeing the Empire case, which was globally circulating. This young woman who was a medical student, brutally being raped by 5 young men. So the other side to this gender problem is actually young working class men that are constructed as these sort of sexual monsters. India, according to demographers of India and China has the excess male problem, so which is demographically true because of selective killing of infanticide and killing of young girls, that the male-female ratio is skewed, right? So the idea is that young men do not have access to adequate young women and might turn to a range of threatening activities from rape to terrorism, right? The book is called Bear Branches, very heartbreaking. So the other side to the gender problem is rape and the sexual monsters working class young men. The runaway boy figure or something like that. The failed neoliberal subject. The good neoliberal subject is the shopping consumer woman who wants her rights, who chooses to have single motherhood. The emerging LGBTQ subject, who is also good and is wanting domesticity and consuming and asking for rights. The danger then is the working class woman and the sex worker trend, right? So in some ways, this mimics the policing of womanhood, of a specific kind of gender representation. This is literally providing transgenders with economic access and economic and development empowerment projects so that they don't become sex workers, right? And the dialogue that is taken up by sort of national transgender organizations, there was a shift from like the figure of Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, from being this very sex-positive, national hijra figure, talking about sex very openly, and using the discourse of human rights for advancing trans rights, to a shift to becoming the good Hindu hijra, asking for inclusion into the Indian nation on the basis of that Gujarats have always been part of Hinduism, right? So it's policing of womanhood in a new lens. It's this gender policing becoming the good trans subject, not the sex worker subject.
Actually, the subtitle in the book, Policing the Good Trans, in the subtitle.
There you have it.
I should have a book first.
You know the Elena Mizulina, who I had shown earlier, she's actually sort of on the march. So she's spearheaded additional legislation that will make you cringe. One is recently, within the last month, the sort of decriminalization of wife battery. So in the 90s, there was, oh my gosh, an immense amount of organizing around addressing domestic violence. And I did a lot of research in all of that because that's precisely where the anti-trafficking work came out of. So basically that's being undone. And in addition, there's now a divorce tax. So what I would say is that, and this is actually, I was talking about it with a friend of mine from Belarus the other day, that also there's what's called anti-gender agendas. So you think this could be kind of cool, like anti-gender, it's like a it's a liberating us from gender binaryism, right? But it's actually a super uber conservative backlash to gender as this PC concept, as something that is imported. So there's a new political party called No Gender, which is actually about like no recognition of gender issues, right? And this is happening at the university level too. I don't know if you all know that Central European University is under threat right now. It's sort of a landmark institution in Central Europe, funded independently by the Soros Foundation, and the Hungarian government is going to shut it down. St. Petersburg European University is on the docket, and these are places in where the research, sociological research, is happening on what's going on in these countries, and they're going to be shut down. So yeah, in my case at least, or my Russia case, it's very much intertwined with the anti-gender stuff.
So I have a follow-up question about the passage of the law by the BJP. I'm curious, what did Congress and the minor parties say? Was the push for this entirely by the BJP trying to opt for their own version of trans rights in this particular context? You were talking about this religious context. And if so, did Congress say nothing? I mean, because Congress tends to be, at least in my limited understanding of living politics, tends to be more associated with the traditional European liberal project and more economic leftism, even though it's not as much as it used to be. And so how did the passage of the law actually go through? Was there actual debate over the content, or was it just sort of everyone agreed?
So it hasn't passed, the law hasn't passed, but it's been introduced and has gotten traction, and it was being debated. So that's a very good question about which is the Congress political parties, the other major political party, which has lost considerably in the past two elections, and so its size in the parliament and presence has shrunk. And so I think you bring up a very good point about Congress being this sort of bastion of liberal enlightenment-based constitutional nation state, and BJP has always been read as this sort of right-wing Hindu vision of the country. And what I think one of the missions of BJP is in engaging with especially transgender rights issues, especially like protecting trans subjects, is wanting to project itself as this liberal, government, right? But it is still maintaining an Nehruvian state. It is still extending state protection to multiple minority bodies, right? So in some sense, Congress has taken up some of the critiques that Hijra-Koti organizations are making from different regions and different political parties, but has actually kind of nationally remained silent because some of the major Hijra national figures have switched parties from Congress to BJP. So they're in this moment trying to figure out what to put out in order to not have any more defections from Congress to BJP of the different LGBTQ formations. So there's that sort of complex side of it too.
With that issue too, so talking more about that, when you're looking at then the BJP, for whatever reason, taking that position, putting out that, at least trying to show that they are protecting minority classifications of people, is something to be said for the ultimate action of the Indian National Congress then, because of the fact that they have been in power so long, and just now are starting to address the issue. There's a lot of inaction on their part when they were in power, as opposed to BJP for whatever reason, political, social, or purely media relations, is acting like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I do wanted to say though, it's not like BJP is actively trying to do many things for LGBTQ rights. I mean, this is, they're trying to, accidentally because of Supreme Court decision, Transgender Bill of Rights got framed as Transgender Bill of Rights and takes language from human rights and different transgender rights discourses. It's not really actively trying to do specifically things on LGBTQ issues. It's very morally invested in keeping the anti-sodomy laws in place. So it's if at all I'm saying anything, I'm saying it's very conflicting. There is no one story what the BJP government is doing. But I do want to say that Hindu right wing has a strange kind of queerphilia, because Hindu right wing is opposed to the naming, traditionally has been opposed to the naming of LGBT rights, but has had a love affair with different homosocial gods and goddesses and figures, right? So Paolo Bacchetta writes about this, that the accommodation of same-sex desire within human rights discourse is very easy because it's brothers loving brothers, protecting mothers and daughters from the raping Pakistanis. So, and in that light love between men, love between women, is sort of, there is a philia and different kinds of, I've been in seminars together on religion and sexuality with my colleague here from grad school. They'll vouch to different kinds of figures, gods and goddesses who attempt to love between, androgyny and stuff. So the BJP has this kind of strange queerphilia. So there's no one story to this. There's multiple figures to this.
Thank you very much. So my question is a little bit inchoate, but for some reason both of your presentations made me think of Freud's civilization and its discontents. And I think it's because I sort of asked myself, in what way power is being exercised and for what reason, right, over these communities and individuals. And in a way, I wonder if in both cases, there's basically a kind of anxiety about something else, great power status and its decline, or some kind of whether or not they're part of civilization, as it's defined by others, and then the instrumentalization of this kind of category to shore up, I guess, some kind of cohesion on that front. So I just wonder whether Freud's prescription in a way is also appropriate, right? That in a way, to resolve these problems, we have to go beyond rights, and because all sorts of rights and discourses, are not necessarily emancipatory, but they can actually fortify figures, and that disciplines and constitutes the superego that tells us that we're not living up to some crazy standard that nobody's ever lived up to. It sort of does make me think about psychoanalytic investigations of national consciousness or nationhood in a way. And do either of you, have you looked at any of that kind of approach to thinking about these kinds of questions?
I've thought about it. and then kind of hovering around it. Interestingly, the first psychoanalytic society outside of Vienna was established in Calcutta during this colonial time. So there is a presence of psychoanalytic literature that actually looks through into iconographies and psychoanalysis, so with Donegger's work. But I just wanted to say that I think it's really funny that you bring that, not funny, but it's coincidental that you bring that up, because the one thing I do want to say again is that this idea of third gender and having male, female, and other must also be situated in its regional geopolitics, right? So the first country in South Asia to have both gay marriage and third gender-based male, female, other in different options was Nepal. So, and then India promptly followed suit, because if Nepal has something on the books, we are the harbinger of democracy in South Asia. Like, so that is India's regional cosmopolitanism. Like, who is the model democratic nation in South Asia? It's India. So suddenly this project became an imperative. And then around the same time, we see Pakistan passing also third gender-based legislation. And so, and then Bangladesh passes a third gender-based legislation. And at the same time, violent killings of gay and lesbian activists are happening in Bangladesh, right? So we must situate this in its regional geopolitics and different kinds of internationalisms, different kind of regional cosmopolitanisms. But I also, someone who has worked in international development for 16 years, don't want to abandon the project of rights and the project of relationship with state. So to go back to some of your questions, because I think there is some strategic need and space for that, and I don't want to also present a totalitarian critique where I take away from the work of activists and policy folks who are cracking open spaces to, in sort of disjointed incrementalist ways to make some gains. So I don't want to completely walk away from that project.
Thank you. So part of what everyone was just talking about speaks to my question, but part of it, so I have an informational question and then a question about sort of where to go from here. So the informational question, I'm just ignorant, is to what extent have there been attempts, or successful or otherwise, in international declarations or treaties to explicitly talk about sexuality or gender identity so I'm just sort of curious where things stand on the international scene in that kind of effort, and sort of if there have been those efforts, which countries are the ones standing in the way of those kinds of efforts, like the UN or elsewhere. And second of all, I guess the question is, if those have been pushed in terms of rights, if that's the kind of language in which these efforts are being made, then to what extent do you want to sort of support those efforts as, even in some qualified ways, being sort of progress or sort of going in the right direction, even if you have some misgivings? This is really for both of you, misgivings about, say, the language of rights. And so partly ignorance and then partly, so on this thing, I might have just thought naively this would be a good thing if we could have a kind of international declaration that a lot of countries are signing on to. It'd be a way to put pressure on certain countries, as we have on other kinds of issues, like the environment and so forth. But I'm sort of wondering what you think about those kinds of efforts.
Well, we could piece together some things. I know, maybe you're familiar that I think it was in 2014 that Hillary Clinton made a speech with the United Nations saying that gay rights were human rights and human rights were gay rights. And that was sort of an important moment, at least in terms of global discourse around the need to include LGBTQ rights within a global apparatus around human rights. So, and there are international organizations like what is the acronym? International Gay and Lesbian
Human Rights Commission, which is Outfront.
Yeah. So it's called Outfront. Okay. So I know that since you've done work with that, I'll let you sort of speak to that, and you as well, Mark. But one thing that I wanted to kind of interject, though, is that the problem with sort of international certain rights being litmus tests is that, that we often just stop there, right? And the efficacy, given how resources, data is collected to legitimate resources, and those resources then legitimate certain strategies. And so these rights become self-fulfilling prophecies in terms of not expanding beyond sort of that feedback loop. And this happens in a variety of instances around human rights issues, whether it's trafficking or LGBTQ rights. And so the problem there is then we're not really necessarily addressing, or we're assuming who the subject of LGBTQ rights are. And I think that your project speaks to that, and that's a question that I know that you're really interested in. And I would just say as an example is that, and kind of referring to the uncanny, maybe is something we could look into in terms of Freud's work, is that, that these so-called neutral rights are always nationalist projects. So think about like Jasbir Puar's work, or others who are working on homo-nationalism or the homo-emancipation projects of Europe. We see them as like the example, the litmus test, right? These are things that these progressive countries are doing, but they're also doing them as a way to regulate entrance into citizenship for refugees and migrants. So it's always a nationalist project. It's never not a nationalist project. So I see both the possibilities, but also the limitations, is that they are always, it seems to be at least, always tied to national projects that are never just alone about sexual politics, right? And we see this in Europe, we see this in the United States, and that's, I guess, the potential sort of collateral damage of sort of strictly LGBTQ rights in terms of this international. I mean, I think we can critique Hillary Clinton and Bush. And just think about,
Time.
Do you want to say something? I want to take a little quick jump in.
I just wanted to quickly say that in 2007 there is a document that got signed by multiple actors and was called the Yogyakarta Principles at the island of Yogyakarta, that was seeking to extend the human rights principles and read them in the context of sexual and gender orientation. However, I mean, that's the other part of the work that I'm not going to add. However, the document remains a document, right? It remains a compact standard, sometimes picked up within different UN bodies and sometimes not. But it is there, and I think operationalization is the question.
Yeah, I just want to put in a bid to the, to the both the students, but also the professors in the crowd outside of the law school. I guess partly I'm always struck by how profound the commitment to and reification of rights are by the time students come to the law schools. And there's a powerfully rich non-law school indigenous history of critiques of rights that I really just, it should be a much bigger part of our discourse. As powerful as the discourse of rights is, it can also sort of take, I think, both the political and conceptual hits of the critiques and really reveal the ways in which rights operate sort of domestically and internationally, often as no more than tactics or strategies rather than things that people who may or may not exist in the forms that we ordinarily imagine them to exist sort of assert in ways that look like they must always do work. And so the provisionality of rights as a conceptual matter, as a practical matter, just often by the time people get to law school, at least, I can only report on that, it's really hard to get people to sort of step back from that and to see really how rights operate, how we think about them in more complex and critical sorts of ways. So I would just sort of put the bid out, in part because I think it really opens up all sorts of possibilities that the critiques that the panelists today have presented sort of really show, like how complex and beautiful and problematic and tortured and liberatory and sort of subalterning rights actually are in their lived realities. And I think that we are officially out of time, so please join me in thanking the panelists.